Not much physical change has occurred in the fertile Mississippi River Valley during the past several thousand years. Major crops are still corn, beans, and tobacco, just as it was centuries ago. But sociologically, life for the indigenous people of North America forever changed with the discovery of the New World some 500 years ago. Most American history books begin with Columbus in the year 1492. Anything that occurred before that time is usually left up to the anthropologists, who view the pre-Columbian period as American prehistory or prehistoric. But to Native Americans, there is no such thing as prehistory, because to them, their religions and cultures have always existed. The foundations of their cultures have been in existence for thousands of years and continue unbroken to this day. These traditions have been passed from generation to generation by word of mouth from respected tribal elders and medicine men and women. But to the scientific community, oral history has little or no basis without written documentation to substantiate information found in Indian legends. And because ancient Native American burial grounds don't resemble cemeteries of other world cultures, problems with the sacrosanctity of the land came into question. Mississippian tribes buried their dead in mounds of earth. As westward expansion forced them from their native homelands and sacred burial grounds, the locations that for so long had remained one with the earth were susceptible to excavation and exploitation. One such excavation in 1927 revealed a Mississippian burial ground near the farming community of Lewistown, Illinois. Dr. Don Dixon, a chiropractor, discovered what is now the Dixon Mound State Museum. Dixon excavated 237 skeletons of a Mississippian tribe living in central Illinois between 900 and 1400 AD. In 1930, he pitched a tent over the site and began charging the public admission. Taken over by the state in 1945, the burial display remains open to the public today in the midst of a national repatriation controversy. While thousands of Native American skeletons warehoused in museums and universities across the nation are being returned for reburial, Dixon Mounds has become the focus of a national confrontation between Illinois state officials and American Indian nations. Native Americans view the practices at Dixon Mounds as government-sanctioned grave desecration. What anthropologists consider prehistoric Native American remains, prolific with scientific data, are also what Native Americans believe to be their ancestors. Native Americans are bound by tradition and cultural beliefs that guarantee their ancestors an uninterrupted journey through the spirit world, completing their sacred circle of life. They want the remains of their ancestors removed from public view and reburied. At the same time, some in the scientific community argue that burying the bones would jeopardize the continuing studies of prehistoric cultures, which benefit all of mankind. No situation better illustrates this controversy than the events that occurred on a farm alongside the Ohio River near Uniontown, Kentucky. In 1988, 10 entrepreneurs who dealt in Indian artifacts paid a private landowner $10,000 to excavate a prehistoric burial site. Their actions became known as the shovel, heard round the world, and brought the issue of free enterprise versus grave desecration to the forefront of American consciousness. At that time, Kentucky, like many other states, had no laws which specifically addressed the issue. Miles Hart was the first investigator on the scene.
I was on that site looking at some 400 plus holes that out of came somewhere from 835 to 1,200 bodies. My only involvement was that I received a phone call from State Police Headquarters telling me to check into this. It's hard to describe the feeling. this total devastation, the amount of acreage that was covered in the graves, and without exception, every law enforcement officer that was on that site at that time indicated verbally that it was wrong, that what was done there was wrong, and that something needed to be done to stop it. Right after the restraining order was issued and the Slack Farm became a crime scene, just a person walking across the field, whether they touched anything other than the bottom of their feet to the ground, if they altered that site in any way by just walking across, it was a Class D felony. The act that was committed by the individuals that dug those remains was a Class A misdemeanor. That's frustrating.
As word spread, representatives of the American Indian movement toured the site.
It was really a really emotional thing when we went out there and seen this, you know, this severe disrespect for human remains, let alone Indian remains. You know, they just scattered the bones on the ground. The skulls that had any kind of defect to them, they were busted because they couldn't, you know, they couldn't put a candle on top of it or make ashtrays out of them or something like that. So they busted them. And these urns, these big urns, what they put the little babies in, they put their bones in there and then they bury the urns with the bones in there. Well, they just pick them up like that and just dump the bones out on the ground, took the urns, you know. And it was really, really a bad thing to see at that time, you know. And so right away, Dennis and me decided that we were going to have to get the public involved in this, because an Indian issue in Indian country doesn't go very far. We found that when we left, you know, these people would sneak back in there. And so Dennis asked me if there was any way that I could, you know, stay out there or keep a guard on there. So I set my teepee up there. And, you know, it was 6 months I was out there. You know, that's a long time. It was a large sacrifice, but I don't think it was large enough for what was done there.
The Slack Farm created awareness throughout the world through different articles like National Geographic, all the newspapers, different articles, Time magazine. It's been in every major paper in the United States. It created an awareness. Now this awareness is in Native American history. We had the first ceremonies there for reburial at the Slack Farm, and we had several thousand people come in that weekend. We've had 2 memorial services since then. This year, 91 will be the last ceremonies. This will end our commitment for 4 years. It was set up for grieving.
Dennis Banks, a founder of the American Indian movement, was surprised by the positive support from the local community.
The important thing about Uniontown, the reburial ceremonies, is that when we said that we were going to come here for a memorial service and install or instill dignity to overcome the terrible destruction, we hoped that we would be able to gain support in Kentucky. But the kind of support that began to come overwhelmed me, because it not only brought people here, but it began a process with the state legislators where they overturned, or they changed one of the laws here in the state of Kentucky, so that they changed it from a misdemeanor to a felony. So there was legislative support. And then the communities began to support us when we came out year after year. And I think the amount of people that are here now, today, proves to me that we were very successful in trying to begin an educational process, where they would come and to listen to us and to find out what are the spiritual reasons that we object to desecration.
Approximately 100 miles west of Uniontown, Kentucky, is the Wycliffe Mounds Research Center. Located at the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, the site consists of an excavated prehistoric Mississippian village and burial mounds. Owned and operated by Murray State University since 1983, the center has been open to the public since the 1930s. Sensitive to the reburial issue, Director Dr. Kit Wessler has begun dismantling the burial display and is developing interpretive displays which will eventually include skeletal reproductions.
My work on this site and my discussions with a number of Native American representatives go earlier, quite a bit earlier than the Slack Farm incident. Slack Farm, I think, shocked a lot of other people into an awareness of what the problem is. The only new legislation Slack Farm created was to elevate the status of burial desecration from a misdemeanor to a felony. Unfortunately, we've had very great problems in enforcing that. We have had judges in Kentucky throw out burial desecration cases on the grounds that they were just Indians and they didn't matter. In the Slack Farm case, the county prosecutor chose not to take it to court, so the people who were involved in that were not punished in any way. So we have some real problems with the laws in Kentucky, both with the stated laws and with the enforcement of it. This particular village is a Mississippian village, and it dates, as my best estimate, to approximately AD 1100 to 1350. We're right in the middle of an area that's known as the vacant quarter, which we think right now was abandoned before European contact with the New World. So neither on archaeological grounds nor on historical grounds can we trace this group of people on this site to living descendants. There are living descendants of Mississippian peoples, all the historic groups that we know of in the Southeast, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Cherokee, are descended from Mississippian peoples. And in general, we can see that descent, but we can't trace this group specifically yet. As I understand the laws, they call for repatriation to a known descent group, or at least a culturally affiliated group. So on the one hand, we can't make that connection directly. On another hand, any reburial that happens with these remains, I hope will keep them on this site to be reburied here. So that keeps us from having to return them to a specific group. I've been going through a long shift in attitude on the whole reburial question. When I first came here and was presented with this cemetery, which of course we inherited from the 1930s, my feeling was that there was nothing wrong with it. Since then, I've talked to a lot of people, including Native Americans, including non-Native Americans. I've spent some time in Africa and in Europe and talked to them about the connection that people feel to the past. More recently, I've been thinking a lot about my great-great-grandfather on my mother's side. My mother's family comes from northeastern North Carolina, and apparently my great-grandfather was at least perceived by the family to be Indian. I don't know much more about him than that. If my colleagues in North Carolina were doing a project, or if a construction project ran across my great-great-grandfather's grave, I would expect to have something to say about it. Because I'm an archaeologist, I would understand the need for analyzing those bones, and I would be very willing to see some autopsy samples taken and kept for further analysis. But I'd like to see the grave respected and the remains reburied. And I think I would see that done before I walked away from it. If a judge in North Carolina had done something like a judge in Kentucky did and said that these were just Indian bones and it didn't matter, I would be extremely annoyed, and I would definitely have something to say about that. So I have to respect the fact that modern Native Americans feel at least that much connection, and probably even more connection, to their ancestors, and I think we should respect that. One of the problems in giving up a group of remains to an Indian group is that 5 years from now we may decide that another group is actually the descendants, and who's responsible for that mistake. That's one of the reasons we're all hesitant to do that. But if, for instance, here at Wycliffe we rebury the remains on the site, that question is less important because we've still got them where they came from. The arguments, there are a lot of different arguments involved, and my personal view is heading towards reburial, but I don't necessarily think that I have the final answer to it.
The Illinois State Museum Board recommended in December 1989 that the burial wing of the Dixon Mound State Museum be closed to public view. Governor Jim Thompson, acting upon their recommendation, announced that the exhibit would close in February 1990. It remained open through April, when Thompson, reacting to pressure from the local community, said the exhibit would remain open while he analyzed the exhibit's impact. 5 months later, Thompson reversed his original decision and announced the burial exhibit would stay open to the public. Dr. Judith Frank explains.
Well, the museum, Dixon Mounds, and our parent museum, the Illinois State Museum, and our board, and the agency of which we're a part, the Illinois Department of Energy and Natural Resources, are all on record as saying that because of the reasons that have been given by other institutions similar to ours in closing exhibits of human remains, that we felt that the time had come for this to be closed. So I obviously do agree that we have to pay attention to the climate of the times, that we can't just dig in our heels and say, well, this has been here for 64 years and it's going to continue as it is, and we're going to ignore what's going on in the rest of the country and at similar sites.
Well, first of all, when you compare the amount of destruction that happened here at Slack Farm here in Uniontown, Kentucky, and compare it to the type of digging that is going on at Dixon Mound, it really doesn't compare at all, because on one hand we have people who are robbing graves in an illegal manner, and in the other situation you have an institutional supported desecration. And to me that really smacks of immorality. It certainly is unethical, it's immoral. I think that's the central issue with Native American people.
Governor Thompson was scheduled to arrive at 9:30. By 9:15, a sizable crowd of onlookers had gathered in the museum lobby. Most of them already have an opinion about the bone display.
I hope he decides to keep the burial site open.
What does it mean to you?
Well, a lot of memories, plus I just think it should be left open.
We feel that this is part of our heritage, is part of our history, and we're very proud of the mounds, we're very proud of the burial site, and it's something that we like to show people as part of our heritage.
This kind of activity is very repugnant to Native Americans. It always has been, and is becoming very repugnant and unacceptable museum practice to most civilized people.
The governor says he values those opinions, but he's come here to get a first-hand impression. After about 35 minutes inside, Thompson emerges from the bone room to reflect on what he's seen.
If it has only dramatic value, then it ought to close, because then it's a peep show, and that's wrong. If there is an educational value to it, then I'd like to hear how that can be interpreted.
While the arguments may be easy to understand, deciding whether to close this room or keep it open will be very difficult. That's why the governor plans to do a substantial amount of research before reaching a conclusion. Thompson says he plans to talk to museum experts, Native Americans, and school children before making a final decision. Until then, this view of the bones will remain open to the public. At Dixon Mounds, Ben Stone, 19 Eyewitness News.
The educational value of viewing human remains by the public is probably one of the issues that has received the most discussion and is one of the subjects of greatest controversy here. Many people say there's no value whatever to it, or a negative value in that it teaches, you know, maybe even a disrespect for human life, or human death in this case. Others feel that you can learn a great deal about the humanity of ancient peoples by looking at burials, that it is a more direct approach to people. In other words, they can come to the museum and they can see a lot of things and they don't have much impact on them, but if they see the burial, it has a tremendous impact and makes the other things seem much more real, because it is very real. So it's certainly an attention-getting device.
This has no educational benefit. It has no scientific benefit at all that hasn't already been gleaned from these bones. I mean, anything scientific has already been done with this exhibit, and it's being maintained strictly as a visual sideshow. It's an attraction for people to come up and look at the stark reality, the morbid curiosity of looking at an Indian cemetery. There is nothing educational at all. I mean, what do these bones teach you? There's nothing.
Today, the issue is no longer a professional museum decision. It's a political issue. When one has two segments of the American population, in this case, both in Illinois and out, one finds that different people align differently with very strong feelings on an issue like this, then the politicians have to become involved. And to date, the decisions have become political decisions based on the strong support for keeping the exhibit open in Central Illinois.
Governor Thompson told the crowd at Dixon Mounds today that he was wrong to have closed the burial ground in the first place. He says since these Mississippian Indians have no ties to any other existing tribes, this display belongs to the people of Illinois.
I think the Mississippian Indians who lived here are a unique part of Illinois' culture and heritage, not Indian culture and heritage.
An Indian activist group had demanded the mounds be closed down, claiming the burial ground was disgraceful to the dead. They have vowed to picket the burial ground if Thompson allows it to remain open.
They're entitled to come here and make their feelings known, obviously, and there won't be any attempt to shut off their point of view. It's a legitimate point of view, but I think it's wrong.
That's a very poor argument. It smacks of racism, and to say that you can't prove that there's any direct lineage that I think that's not even the issue. It's a moral issue. I mean, a white person or a black person or any person, any human being, should feel outraged, and that, anybody that's disturbed, any bones that are disturbed, should be an outrage for people of any color. I think that's the real issue that confronts us, not whether we can prove we're related to, to the bones of people that were buried here.
The people living in the Dixon Mounds area in the middle 1200s migrated slightly to the south, only about 40 miles or so. And they only lived here for about another century. And the population began to dwindle, the numbers became smaller, and the population, in fact, may have been totally wiped out by diseases and epidemics in the middle 1400s. Certainly there is no archaeological evidence of these people in existence anywhere that we've seen in the Midwest.
Opinions within the scientific community differ, as Dr. Reedhead explains.
You may ask, what is the basis for the claim that there are no lineal descendants of the people of Dixon Mounds? That is an absurd and spurious claim. How would one ever prove, in relation to a prehistoric society, that every single living person in that culture had been extincted? There's no way of ever proving that. Furthermore, it's counter to everything we know from ethnohistory and from cultural anthropology. Even when war did take place and all of the men in a group might be killed, the pattern among tribal peoples is for the women and children to be adopted into the tribe of the conquering people, so their genes spread. Then when we look at the history of the migrations of Indian peoples from out of eastern North America into the Midwest and then eventually into onto reservations in Kansas and Oklahoma, what we find is that as groups were weakened and became incapable of supporting themselves, or the people became incapable of taking care of themselves, the survivors were adopted into adjacent tribes. So today, we probably have the lineal descendants of the people of Dixon Mounds in the sense of their genes among all of the different tribes of Oklahoma. They can all legitimately lay claim to be descendants of Dixon Mounds in all probability. It's easier to make a case for that than to make a case that they were all exterminated.
We can't trace the population at Dixon Mounds to any specific group through any scientific, historical, or any other means. That's not to say that this is not an American Indian population, but as far as being able to identify them with a specific group of Native Americans, we can't do that at this point.
I don't understand when the state talks about lineal descendants or lineal relationship, because you have one culture that's holding hostage the remains of another culture and saying, prove to us you're related. I say, prove to me that I'm not related. Any of those remains in Dixon Mounds, no, I can't prove to the state that I'm related to one of them. But the state can't prove that I'm not related. But there's one thing that I can prove, and that the man that made the decision to keep this open is not related to any of them down there.
Dr. Robert Archibald, president of the Missouri Historical Society, has repatriated skeletal remains from the museum's collection to local Indian leaders for reburial.
I know that from the standpoint of some institutions and some scholars, there will be argument that lineal descendancy must somehow constitute direct generational relationships between people whose skeletal remains are in question and Native Americans alive today. I don't think the question of proof of lineal descendants I think that's sort of a bogus question. If Native Americans have sensitivities, which are really religious and spiritual sensitivities that I think most non-Indian people don't comprehend, but if their sensitivities are violated, and if they believe themselves to be lineal descendants, then we better act as if that's true, unless we can disprove it, and I think disproving it would be as difficult as proving it.
I feel that it's not necessary to excavate burial sites, to disturb remains. It's our belief that when you pass on into the spirit world, that your body should return to the earth, that the circle of life as you see it, you know, as we worship in a circle, we dance in a circle, we counsel in a circle, our drums are a circle, teepees are a circle. It's a recognition of that cycle of life, death, and the travel to the spirit world. And that I think they could learn more by talking to living Indians than they ever could by studying the remains of deceased ones. It's our responsibility as Indian men and women to look after the youth, to care for the elders. Just as important it is to get those ancestors out of the vaults, out of the museums, out of the paper sacks, plastic bags, steel wooden boxes, and back into earth so they could decompose and become one with the earth and provide a nutrient for a new life, new grasses to come up. And the animals could come and feed at those grasses, and that life cycle begins again. That's why it's important to us to address this issue of repatriating those remains and sacred artifacts, sacred objects, because it's our spiritual health that's at stake here. That's why it's important for us to be responsible and take care of these ancestors that cannot defend themselves anymore. It's our understanding and our teachings that many things that we do today in our contemporary governments and our attempts to provide services to our citizens and in our attempts to provide adequate educational opportunities for our youth and our attempts to deal with alcoholism, a drug rate, provide shelter for our people, that these efforts will not be successful until we deal with taking care of our ancestors.
Extensive scientific archaeological research and anthropological studies conducted at Dixon Mounds have given insights into the lifestyles of prehistoric cultures. Recent genetic studies have resulted in medical breakthroughs which benefit all of mankind.
The reason that the Dixon population is so valuable to osteologists is that it is a large group, that it's what they call, I guess, relatively genetically pure, in that, you know, there aren't a lot of other ethnic groups involved. These are all Indians. You don't have a mixture of peoples from a lot of different areas in one burial. And also, it covers a time span of about 300 or 400 years, and we can date burials within that 300 or 400 years with pretty great accuracy. That means that we can not only define a health pattern or a population's status in terms of its physical state, but we can trace it through a number of years, through a number of centuries, and we can also compare that with other archaeological material, such as where the villages are, how they're moving around, what kinds of things they're eating and hunting, and what their lifestyle is, and try to draw some conclusions or at least come up with theories.
Native Americans, however, feel that education and research should not condone the desecration of their ancestors' graves.
When you're talking about a genetically pure society and the fact that the scientists say that Native Americans should be very happy or very glad that they have this contribution and that this is there to show 400 years of a pure society, I think that's paternalistic. I think that's a very paternalistic and a very colonialistic view. We know what's best for the Indians. Does it matter that to Indians that fine line of moral and ethic conduct has been crossed by archaeologists?
Research here has not been specifically targeted toward any racial or ethnic group, such as targeting for benefits, say, the American Indians of today. The applications from this have been very broad. For instance, most recently, Dixon Mounds figured very prominently in a study of rheumatoid arthritis, where they have now pretty much determined that it is a genetic trait rather than an acquired disease. But no, we haven't done any work here that would be specifically oriented to one cultural group.
Out of all those papers, out of all those research papers, what information have they been able to find that benefits Indian people today? That benefits disease, poverty, that benefits any of the problems that Indians face today? I don't think that there are. I think it's strictly scientific curiosity under the guise of all mankind. Because if this is truly to benefit all mankind, then can't we glean some information from their bones that would help us to understand their history and their people?
Floyd Westerman, an actor featured in the highly acclaimed movie Dances with Wolves, visited Dixon Mounds.
Recently, the movie Dances with Wolves gave me an opportunity to play Chief Ten Bears. And to be able to play that role in Dances with Wolves gave me insights to be chief leader and have these kind of responsibilities. It's no different than the responsibilities I have today. No different than the relationships I have with the spirit world today would have been the same as yesterday. We know our responsibilities. That's why we'll never give up until place is closed and our ancestors are buried into the earth again. To see our ancestors put on display like this not only makes me sad, but outlines the kind of work we have to do to educate people. We are a patient people, and we've seen America go through its changes about what it has learned about us. And most recently, Dances with Wolves, I think, brings a new awareness to who we are and how we associate ourselves with our world around us, how we connect ourselves to the spirit world. And I think because of Dances with Wolves, it opens up a more human understanding about our way of life. And that our way of life and our belief in the spirit world never changed. And that's a good beginning for us to begin teaching people who don't respect, but who respect only their burial sites. And they look upon ours as subjects of education for archaeological study, subjects of education for anthropological study. All these in the name of education, because education gives them the right.
The Illinois Grave Protection Act, passed in 1989, states that human skeletal remains will be treated with dignity and respect. But who defines dignity and respect?
I think you have a double set of standards. You definitely have two different cultural concepts of those words. I think the law was written, the words were used to have the general public think that there is some type of a sanctity to the way these remains are being held, when in fact they're just warehoused.
I think there obviously different people can agree or disagree on what that standard would be for dignity and respect under the statute. We're going to try to address that in the regulations. For one thing, all remains would be, unless there is a relative or some other related individual involved, all remains would be transferred from our agency after the project was over to the Illinois State Museum, and at that point would be subject to the Illinois State Museum's procedures with regard to access. And I believe the standard there is that there would be no access for anyone other than perhaps a scientist who had a legitimate project that was approved in advance, perhaps to try to do a study on disease, try to find some health information that might be available depending on the nature of the population.
Since Dixon Mounds was open back in 1927, through the time that the Dixons had it to the present day, I think the one thing that has always set it apart from all other excavations is, one, the burials, the artifacts have never been moved or changed or rearranged in any way. And the other aspect is that it has always been treated with great respect.
However, Alan Harn's book, first published in 1971, indicates the burial exhibit has been changed and rearranged to enhance the exhibit, contradicting his prior statement.
I hear the local people up there lamenting the fact that these people are laying right in the place where their family buried them. That these people, yes, they were uncovered, but they've never been totally excavated from their final resting place. And therefore, there has not been total desecration there. But from our understanding, these people have been removed, that this exhibit has been maintained as an exhibit by replacing particular skeletal parts that are not aesthetically pleasing to the eye, that they have to swap, that they have to maintain this exhibit. That, to me, throws off the educational values of this exhibit. How can you maintain this as educational when you may have 7 different body parts within one skeletal remain down there? How can the people lament the fact that these people were buried in their original place when they may all have been removed at one time or the other to be cleaned and to be preserved and then put back in place? From our understanding, that when Dr. Dixon first opened this, he had a tent over it and he charged people admission, that they went in and they walked amongst the remains. How can the integrity of that exhibit remain if you have people walking through the cemetery?
Another excerpt from Harn's book indicates that the bones are moved on a periodic basis for cleaning and preservation to prevent further decomposition.
Is dignity and respect perhaps treating the bone, shellacking it, preserving it? Is that dignity and respect? I think you have a double set of standards.
It's sometimes very frustrating, particularly when we hear their arguments, that is, again, the archaeological, anthropological community in particular. Sometimes we think that they'll just never understand. And as we analyze that, we see a people that, first of all, fled the countries of their origins to escape from either religious persecution, certainly cultural persecution, and for sure economic and political persecution. And so in coming to the so-called New World, which is not new at all, it had been here for hundreds of thousands, millions of years, and according to our teachings that we have been here, the Great Spirit God put us on this land. And so our culture and our spiritual values and tradition and history go back long before these immigrants fleeing countries of their origins came here to the so-called New World. I think one of the biggest problems that they have, and of course in turn we have, is that having left the countries, the sacred lands of their origins and their sacred ancestors there, they allowed themselves to be stripped of their language, their culture, their music, their art, their traditions, their value system, everything that's important about not only a human being, but for certainly the foundation of nations of people. They've allowed themselves to be stripped of that. Therefore, what is American culture? If Americans can't identify culture as being their own, they find it very difficult to respect the culture, the traditions, the spiritual way of life of indigenous people. So it's that relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. They have to destroy our history, they have to destroy our culture, they have to destroy our language in order to force us, to homogenize us into the so-called mainstream or the melting pot of America, where oftentimes we have settled to the bottom and we remain at the bottom. And today we're rising up and we're saying no to those that continue to desecrate our graves.
In January 1991, a new administration headed by Governor Jim Edgar was sworn into office. Repeated communications with his office by Native American representatives have brought no response. On April 6, 1991, Michael Haney, along with members of the American Indian Movement and numerous supporters, traveled to Dixon Mounds to hold a press conference and a sacred pipe ceremony. For many of them, it was their first visit to the museum.
The American Indian movement was born 23 years ago in the city of Minneapolis out of 475 years of despair and agony and continued desecration of our sacred land and our burial mounds. When the American Indian movement was born 23 years ago, we felt that little of nothing was being taught in the public and parochial school systems of America about Indian culture, Indian tradition, and nothing was being taught about the vast contributions that Indian people made to modern day society. And that's all we could see was our people being put on display in museums and studied in universities. And we have taken a continuous stand since 1968 to have all of the remains of Indian people returned to their tribes, to their nations, for proper burial. This is the ancient ceremony, the pipe ceremony. We have a lot of different tribes, almost 478 tribes in this nation. And we all have a common denominator within our religion. It's the drum here, and the eagle feather, and of course the pipe. What you see is one of our sacred herbs here, a sage, a purification. You can smell it. Creates a good, holy atmosphere, cleansing. We want to tell our ancestors how sorry we are that we have allowed this to happen to them. Telling our ancestors how important it is that we live up to our responsibility and work tirelessly to have these remains covered up. And that we pledge by smoking this pipe that we will not rest until this has occurred. Over the years, you know, whenever we had a ceremony like this, we have asked that the cameras be shut off, but we're not going to do that today because we've been told by one of our spiritual leaders back in Minnesota that it's time that the non-Indian people learn what this is all about, the importance of what we are doing today.
Chico Dulac gives a first-hand account.
When I first went in there, you know, I looked down into that pit there. You know, they built a museum on top of a mound. And I looked down in that pit where they cut the side of the mound away to expose all these bones. And I looked down in there, and it really, really upset me. And these people down there, you know, they looked like they were begging for help, you know. And Clyde Belcart, the national director of the American Indian Movement, asked me at the time, he said, "What do you think about this?" I said, "You know, Clyde," I said, "you know, I've been fighting this thing for off and on most of my life. And I said, it really upsets me to see something like this. I said, I feel like I ought to just jump down there and bury him up."
That says we can't bury our ancestors? No. That you ghouls that dug up?
No, you all get to bury yours.
Officer, tell me what you would do. What would you do if it was your grandmother laying down there?
You would bury her.
Would you cover her up? Would you cover your grandmother up? Or would you leave her on display here for everybody to come in and gawk at? What would you do, officer? We've tried to work with these people. We've pleaded with them. We've talked to them, we've gone to the congressmen, we've passed laws in the United States Halls of Congress that prohibits right here. And yet it takes the direct action. Sometimes you have to take action. Sometimes it's important to do what's right, not necessarily what's legal, or what's right in your own heart. We've exposed a moral gap between Illinois law and federal law. That Illinois has exploited this issue too long. In 1991, we come to tell them it's time to close this. It's time for this desecration to come to a halt.
After conferring with Illinois State Police and museum officials, the governor chose not to file charges against the individuals involved in the protest. Given the state of emotions, many people have asked whether a compromise could be worked out.
We would hope when there are areas that are addressed, such as human remains and associated objects, that there can be some middle ground, some areas of compromise. And I think as far as scientific or medical research with human remains, that many Native Americans are far more open on that issue than on the exhibition of human remains. That is not to say that most aren't proponents of reburial once study is conducted, but I think that you'll find that that's not quite the same issue. And one of the things that we pointed out, I think, in our society, that in medical and scientific research, human tissues are very important to us, whether they be American Indian tissues or tissues from any other cultural or ethnic group. Hospitals and medical schools research human tissues on a regular basis. But earlier populations are very important to us in establishing baseline data before many of the modern changes that human beings are subjected to today. So we would hope that in those areas that some middle ground could be reached in the future.
The compromise comes when people are no longer lured to burial grounds to study skulls and bones and then to later trade them for sale on a mass market and in an amateurish archaeological style. They are culture vultures. They are culture vultures who don't know when to stop because their appetite continues to blind them, because their government-funded program leads them on for more. I think compromise will come when they are finally laid to rest. I think that would be one step to the great reconciliation that we really need between Indian and white people. I think it's very, very strong and ironic that our struggle begins with the struggle of our ancestors standing here with us.
In that cemetery, you see the same fine human qualities that we have today. You have love of home and family, respect of a superior being. Some of the greatest riches that man possesses you can see there in the graves of men who have never met our civilization. The trick is to look beyond the skeletons and beyond the artifacts and into the life of man.
But I think the time is going to come, just as it did when this great nation was divided over the issue of slavery, that the people in the South felt so strongly about the right to enslave human beings, the African people, to toil in the fields, to build the South. And they felt that it was their right. They felt it was the destiny of the black people. They felt so strongly that they sacrificed thousands of their young men, that they sacrificed their homes, all their resources, until they were driven by the North into submission. And now you go to Georgia, you go to Alabama, and you find black congressmen. We've had a black ambassador to the United Nations. And you see black people standing up, participating in controlling communities and cities as mayors, councilmen. And they've had to apologize to the black people. And they had to say, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you were a human being. And it wasn't that long ago that this country used to put those that we call special, that were touched by the Creator. They were given a name of insane and put into asylums where they were beaten They existed under very incredible conditions. And finally, when they understood, when they become civilized to the point that they understood mental illness, they had to apologize to these people and say, I'm sorry, I didn't know he was sick. That it wasn't that long ago that the women of this nation wasn't allowed to vote. It took a great effort to the suffrage movement, a great hardships to the women. They petitioned and petitioned, and they marched, and they voiced their opinions. They finally won that right to participate in the electorals. And this nation had to apologize and say, I'm sorry, I didn't know you had a brain. That there's a time, that's not that far off, that they're going to have to apologize to my people and say, I'm sorry.